Hello, well, welcome back to all humans of HR. Lovely to see all of you once again. And today we are again in conversation with Mr. Chand Narayan. And basis some of the comments that we received in the previous few episodes, we picked up a topic which is extremely relevant um, across across. I mean, it's not just relevant to workplaces. I think it's very relevant to wherever you are trying to work or trying to share space with multiple people. This is bound to exist. And today we're going to try and understand the fundamentals. And is there a way where it can be handled better, or should it be handled at all? And if it is supposed to be handled, what are some things that we need to keep in mind as we approach it? Some of you would have guessed it already. Yes, I'm talking about conflict. The minute there are two different people, there are two different perspectives, there is always a possibility of a conflict. So, conflict management, as we understand, has become a very important aspect when it comes to working with teams in organizations with multiple layers, where and as the complexity and the hierarchy of an organization increases, transparency seems to be a huge challenge. And when the transparency is missing, many a times for the same set of tasks or activities, the perspectives are going to vary, and that many a times leads to friction and conflict. So, to talk more about that, we have Chief along with us here today. So, Chief, let's lay the foundation for understanding conflict. Um, is conflict always negative? From an organizational perspective, is what I'm asking. Is conflict always negative?
Not necessarily. I think there has to be a context, and conflict is extremely necessary if you want to have innovation, creativity. You want to look at doing complex things, accomplishing complex projects. Conflict is extremely necessary. It's an ingredient without which you're likely to fail. The Not true though for very stable and very routine kind of tasks in an organization. There you need um, as little friction as you possibly can manage, because they're just the things that need to be done, and there's no two ways about it. And so there are parts of the business. Now, what I want to point out here, and which might be interesting, is the correlation between conflict and intelligence.
Mm.
Now, anthropologists describe intelligence as the ability to solve novel problems, new problems that have not been solved either in the group's experience or the person's individual experience. And this is something new that the individual or the group faces, and therefore it's this thing called intelligence, which has multiple components, that comes into play in being able to solve a new problem. So when you see this, and the fact that it is confrontations that help us look at a complex situation in a different way from different perspectives, it suddenly starts making a lot of sense. So the more intelligent a society is, the more complexity it generates, the more conflicts it's going to have. And that seems to be true of all evolved um, large human groups.
Right. So now moving to the next question that I have. I mean, as an organization, as a leader of an organization, should we hope for no conflict to ever happen, or should we rather pray for having a team which has the ability to manage conflict better? What is good for the organization of these two options?
So I think a leader has to be very strategic in terms of where and to what extent and how they want to create a conflict. Let me use the words of this guy who's supposed to be one of the foremost exponents of building high performing teams. His famous book is The Five Dysfunctions of a Team.
Mm.
And what he says is, Patrick Lencioni, what he says is that if you imagine the conflict on a continuum where there is zero conflict to there is extremely high level of negative conflict, destructive conflict. If you think of this as a continuum, most teams, he says, are at the extreme end of this continuum, and they try and exist at this extreme end where there is no conflict. Why? Because he feels that they think that any step towards more conflict is a step nearer to hell, which is maximum uh, destructive conflict. But what he says is that what his research and what he finds is that the most high performing teams are able to live on the edge, which is maximum constructive conflict, very little, if any, destructive conflict. And how they do it is, he says, is that it takes one step and then another step and then another step towards more conflict. And then they do go over to the destructive conflict zone. But when they do go over to the destructive conflict zone, because they trust each other, because the level of trust in the group and the relationships is very high, they're able to pull back, make amends, and then come back on the constructive side of the conflict. And also, he says that one very important thing happens when they do step across and get into destructive conflict. When they come back, the healed tissue, the scar tissue, from having resolved that conflict, which was destructive, makes the team stronger. They now know that they have the ability that they will sometimes get into destructive conflict, but they do have the ability to pull it back and come back and live again on the edge, which makes them really innovative and uh, push their own limits as individuals and groups and be really high performing. So I find that very elucidating. I find that very illuminating. I think that's a good way to look at it. So every organization, every team, every situation has its own optimal level of conflict, which can be described as constructive conflict. And then you go beyond that, then that is destructive. I do think, however, when you take it outside of the business context always has a limited time horizon. You cannot endure a conflict over a long period of time. Not so in human life. You do endure conflicts over a long period of time, and sometimes in some issues, and they do resolve at some point of time. But so I think the time horizon also kind of creates this um, situation where your tolerance or threshold for conflict typically in that group is on the lower side.
Very interesting. Very interesting as you say that. Now, should we also look at conflict as a sign of ownership? I mean, if I'm functioning as a team and there is a situation where I believe something needs to be a certain way, or something needs to be approached a certain way, and it's the exact opposite that's happening. If I shrug my shoulder and say, let's get done with it and let me just go with it, let me just go with the motion. Or when I have a little more ownership, is that the time when I try to push back? So, would conflict also arise from the certain element of ownership that exists in certain individuals within the organization?
Oh, absolutely. I think it has a lot to do with if I don't have a skin in the game, I won't bother picking up a conflict with anybody over it. Why would I waste my breath or my energy fighting with somebody or trying to espouse a particular perspective when I have no interest in how it impacts the outcomes? So absolutely, ownership is a big component. However, I think what overrides everything is the relationship. For
Mm.
example, most teenagers get into a major conflict with the parents when they become
Mm.
teenagers. And the biggest reason for that is that the parents have a lot of ownership and they simply can't see their child, who's no longer a child, who's a young adult, is a teenager, do things that are harmful in the parents' perspective for the teenager. So it's their ownership that pushes that conflict over the edge. Um, that's one way of looking at it. However, I also think, and you know my uh, favorite go-to is evolutionary anthropology. So I will drag it in some point or the other. So here is something very interesting that I look at from my perspective, outside of the corporate context alone. Um, you see, very few living things on Earth have an ability to handle conflict the way that we do.
Mhm.
In the sense that most mammals or animals will settle conflicts through physical means. The more powerful you are,
Mm.
um, you are likely to dominate the outcome. Not so in human beings. I think there is, because our evolution is based on collaboration and cooperation. And so conflict is something which is problematic in that sense. But here is where I can give you an insight. And this comes from the honeybees. So it'll be interesting interesting to note for those who don't know that how the honeybees communicate with each other is by dancing. It's a very complex dance. I don't understand how it works. I tried observing it, but I couldn't figure out. But what the experts tell us is that uh, when a honeybee finds a flower or a source of nectar, that means a lot of flowers, um, when it comes back to the hive, when it lands on the hive's surface, it performs a little dance, which is in a figure of eight, and it is at a certain angle with the sun and uh,
The source.
the source and the source, and it is done with a particular amount of energy. Higher the energy, the probably it's conveying that there is a huge amount of
Amount. Yeah.
nectar out there, guys. This is the direction you go to, this is the distance, something like that. And so that's where all the other honeybees who are here rush to. And this keeps happening. Now, the interesting thing is that genetically, about 18% of the honeybees cannot understand the dance. They can dance themselves. They can provide directions to others, but they cannot listen. They are immune to being able to interpret what the hell this bee which is dancing is trying to tell me. And it's very, very critical and important from a ecological perspective, because it is these honeybees who don't understand what the hell this honeybee is saying. They are the ones who go out of the hive and they wander out. They lose their way. I mean, they are lost. Then they find a source, a new source. They come back and they're able to convey this is where that source is. They can dance. They can't understand the dance of others, but they can themselves dance. So what and therefore it is because of these 18% of the honeybees who lose their way, who don't know how to interpret a dance or understand another bee's dance. It is because of these 18% of the honeybees that the bee is able to keep finding new sources of nectar, and that is how the bee the hives thrives and survives. Now, when you think about this from a you look at that principle and you think about it. So for sure, we would also have people who don't want to listen to what the others
They
are
don't fit the normal
saying. Don't fit.
definitions and frameworks.
So I suspect, there's no research that I know of that points this out. Um, but you have these words like iconoclasts who break all the rules, non-conformists. They don't want to go with what the world is telling them to do. And a large part of our teenage is discovering what we want to agree to and what we don't want to agree to, for literally for the rest of our lives. And so I think there could be an important group dynamics here, at both at a evolutionary and genetic level. Intelligence, for example, is genetically heritable. That's clearly there. I mean, the number of if the winning Nobel Prizes was some indicator, you do have that in families. Um, and it's only to do with being able to solve new kinds of problems. So I think that it makes sense to say that there would be some factors that would be selecting for it in the long run, in the long arc of evolution, not necessarily visible to us or in day to day. And that I think is a critical piece that informs my understanding of it, which is that there will always be some people who would see things very differently as compared to others on every topic. So the way that uh, designers of organizations, institution builders, the way that they tend to look at it, even auditors, they say that there's an exception, and you mark exception as 2%. Say whatever you say and do, there'll be 2% which will be an exception to this. And so
Mm.
we have to design for the rule for the majority, 98%, and then we have to
There's
make
some space to maneuver
exceptions.
for the
So I
exception.
No, that's the definition that auditors have for exceptions, right? And if the exceptions are too many, then they will go through with a fine comb and qualify your balance sheet to that extent. And uh, so, yeah, I think that's my understanding. I think it's a very important component of who we are and how we work with each other. Now, the working inside an organization is slightly constrained. Some conflict um, is functional. It helps you do things better. Some other conflict is dysfunctional. Um, so I think there are a lot of dynamics there. It's very difficult to say, this is the line. But yes, from your point, it is important to for the manager, for the leader, for the organization designer to either create these conflicts or and to understand how these conflicts will work together. Any role of an auditor is a conflicting role.
Great.
So the quality control guy in any organization
Or the
is
tester.
yeah. So one has to figure out what's the dynamic that you're creating, which roles are going to be against each other. Most organizations, the sales roles work kind of in tandem, a lot of it is in conflict with the delivery roles, because the delivery guys will always hold up their head, hold their head and say, what the hell did these guys promise that we can't deliver? So one has to be very careful how you design that conflict and how you manage that conflict. So back to you. I can see you have a smile. So you